Well, we are in week 3 of our series, Mountains, and this is a 7-week journey through the 7 mountains that we see Jesus experience, these mountain moments throughout the book of Matthew, as Matthew records the story of Jesus. And so far, we have seen how Jesus show us how victories on the top of a mountain can change how we approach the fights down here. Right, we've also sat with Jesus as he shared the way of living, like a conversation up there that changes how we live down here. And so this week, actually, this is maybe the first time that we get in this series where we get to a moment, this mountaintop experience, that actually feels like a mountaintop experience like we might have been expecting with this kind of series, where it is that get up high and get close to God and that kind of conversation. This week is a mountain reset. But it's not just a single moment. This story this morning, this mountain experience with Jesus is part of a larger arc of these stories that sort of feed one right into the other as Jesus navigates a certain season of his life and of his ministry. It's a set of stories with a mountaintop experience right at the center of the story. And the mountaintop, actually what's interesting about this is the mountain story probably is actually of the stories that make up this sequence of stories. The mountain experience is actually probably the least dramatic of any of the stories that are part of this larger story. But it's still at the center. It still shapes the way that the rest of the story plays out. And so before we get to that story, let's talk about just a foundational truth that will guide us through this story. It's this, is that mountains are often a setting where God meets and teaches his people, right? Mountains are often a setting where God meets and teaches his people. This is true in the Old Testament, right? As far back as we can turn in our Bibles to the beginning of our Bibles, we're going to see moments where God showed up and met his people on mountains. It's true as the story unfolds. It's true in the New Testament. It's true church historically. It's true of us as we experience life in relationship with God. But before we jump into our Jesus on the mountain story, let's talk about 3 quick stories related to mountaintop kinds of experiences. One, actually 2 are in the life of a man named Moses. Many of you know Moses' name. He led God's people out of captivity in Egypt, was a great leader in the people of God. But in Exodus 3, Moses is actually none of those things yet. He's kind of like in exile in many ways, and God is preparing him for the mission that God has placed in front of Moses. And so Moses is on a mountain, and as he's on this mountain, he comes across a bush that's burning. It's burning, but it's not consumed. And God speaks in that moment and reveals to Moses the call that he's placed on his life, invites him to live this courageous life in relationship with God, leading God's people out of captivity. An incredible mountain moment, this moment where God has met one of his people and had a conversation that changes the course of their lives and changes the course of the lives of people around them. In Exodus 24, Moses, having now done the first part of what God had asked him to do, leading his people out of captivity in Egypt, he's now leading his people, and God meets him on this mountain, actually invites him to climb this mountain, and then he gives Moses the 10 Commandments. This conversation about the way the people of God should approach life in relationship with God and with each other and with the world around them. And it takes place on a mountain. Years later, there's a prophet by the name of Elijah. And Elijah has actually been on a fairly good run. He's had some pretty victorious moments in his life, some pretty satisfying in terms of like squaring off against people who are representing false gods and other ways of approaching life. And so he has this moment, but then it leads to a time of persecution and where his peers, his fellow prophets are being mistreated. And so Elijah leaves where he is and he goes to the mountain of God. And in 1 Kings 19 tells the story of Elijah, and he's on this mountain, and then God sends him to a cave. So he's on a mountain, but he's in a cave on a mountain, and God says, I will meet you. And so as the story unfolds in 1 Kings chapter 19, Elijah's waiting for God to show up. And as he's waiting, there was a great and strong wind that tore the mountains and broke in pieces the rocks before the Lord. But it says the Lord was not in the wind. And then after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire, but the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, the sound of a low whisper. And when Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and went out and stood at the entrance of the cave. And behold, there came a voice to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And it set up a conversation. God met Elijah on the mountain. It's interesting to me that all three of those stories actually took place on the same mountain. There's a couple different names throughout Scripture, Mount Sinai or Mount Horeb, but it's the same setting. So the place where Moses was called to lead God's people out of captivity became the place where God gave him instruction for the kind of life that God's people should lead. The place where God's people received instructions for how to live became a place of retreat where God met them and spoke through Elijah to lead them into further obedience in relationship with God. It's a beautiful place. But in this mountain, we would maybe describe it, the Celtic Christians had a name, or have a name that they use for a place like this. They call it a thin place. It's a place where it seems like, as they describe it seems like God is just especially near, where there's like, it feels like you're more proximate to God. A place that God seems to use uniquely to connect with his people. Now, if we tease that out and we unpack that and what that means for us as we make sense of it, there's some real danger in that, because we might start to think that God somehow moves further away from us, or we can get closer to him, like approximately, like we can move in a direction or move like location-wise and be closer to God. It's not that God moves closer or further away from us, or that we move physically closer or further away from God. God is with us. But there are probably places where we feel closer to God, right? Places where we are more in tune with him. Maybe for some of us, these are places where there's distance between us and the distractions of our lives. Right? We look, it's like, I can hear God more clearly just because there's not so much noise around me. This place becomes a thin place, not because of the place itself, but because of its distance from the distractions that keep me from hearing God. Or places that are intentionally designed to draw our attention to God. Some of us have been in these kinds of places where it's like the work that was done to create a space that intentionally lifts our eyes and helps us feel connected to God, draws our attention to him. Or maybe it's places where we've experienced God. It might be this place for you as we gather this morning. We've experienced God, and so we come to that same place with a sense of expectation, with a sense of like a heightened awareness of God's presence, where we remember we have spent time with God in this place. So then when we return to that place, we anticipate spending time with God in that place. Like, take the proximity to God out of the equation. Some of us have places where we go to a place and it's like, I remember meeting a person in this place, or a place that was significant in relationship. And so every time we drive past or we return to that place, we remember the relationship that we have with the people that we've spent time in that place. And so this morning, we talk about a mountaintop experience. And we're talking about more than just climbing a mountain, right? It's not just that we climb and we get closer and closer to God with every foot that we achieve an elevation gain. We're talking about intentionally connecting with God and letting him speak into our lives. And there is something about getting away and connecting with God that helps us see things more clearly, isn't there? But I wonder if maybe sometimes part of why we don't do that, right? It's like if we knew we could go to certain places or we could make certain moves that would help us feel connected and hear God's voice more clearly. Sometimes the reason we don't go up there, right, up there, is because we don't really want to hear what God wants to say to us, what God has to say to us. And so we actually maybe like the thought of God up on the mountain, God distant in that kind of way, that when we're ready, we can make that move, we can climb and go to where he is, but the rest of the time, we're not being confronted with God speaking into our lives in that kind of way. And we want to know that God is there somewhere, but we're just not sure we want to hear what he has to say to us all the time. Kind of like an approach in a relationship with God where it's like break glass in case of emergency, but the rest of the time, God, just let me do my thing. I just want to keep doing what I'm planning to do. And if God, if I need you, then I'll go find you. But other than that, you stay where you are, and I'll keep working at my life as I'm working it now. like a break glass in case of emergency instead of a consistent connection with God. If we need him, we'll go find him. But other than that, we're just going to kind of do our thing. Does that sound familiar to anybody else, or is that just a Nate issue? Despite our best efforts, despite the way that we approach all of this, despite our work to try and find peace with this approach, we still find ourselves with some nagging thoughts. Like, it's moments where we're not talking about just calendar, but we're talking about life that's out of rhythm. Maybe it shows up on our calendar. We're like, I'm just so busy. It's like, I never stop. I keep moving. I'm overbooked, and I don't have any time to actually like even process or think about anything. And we look and we're like, my life is out of balance. It shows up on our calendar, but it's a spiritual issue too, where we live our lives in a way where it's like, I cannot remember the last time that I spent time, right, with God, in conversation with him, in consistent connection with him. And so life, it's like we can't quite put our finger on it, but we just know it's out of balance. It's out of rhythm. And maybe we're asking the question, why does it seem like everybody else knows something that I don't know? Why does it seem like everybody else knows something that I don't know? The way that they approach life and the way that they're operating, it's like my life is out of rhythm. And then when I look at everyone else's life, it's like they seem to know something that I don't know. Is there a lesson that I need to learn? So this mountain story in Matthew 14 is actually all about spiritual rhythm. And it's all about God teaching us a big lesson that's going to shape and change the way we approach our lives. But it starts, actually, this arc of the story of Jesus' life, it actually starts with some hard news, some bad news. And then it moves into one of Jesus' best-known miracles, and then the story will unfold from there. It starts at the beginning of Matthew 14. If you're following in this passage, Matthew 14 begins with Jesus receiving the news that John the Baptist, his family member, a person he's connected with, one who has participated in Jesus' earthly ministry, that he's suffered a brutal death. He's been persecuted, he's been put to death. And so Jesus receives this news and he grieves, but then he grieves and then he goes to a place and begins to heal people. And while he's healing people, this process takes a long time and it leads to one of Jesus' best known miracles. It's the feeding of the 5,000. Right? Jesus, with just a handful of food, begins to break apart the food and feeds 5,000 plus people, a significant number of people. And it's not just that it's, wow, that's a miracle that Jesus fed so many people with such a small amount of food. It's like, it would be a miracle if Jesus would have fed a dozen people with the amount of food that he had. 5,000 is incredible. 1 million would have, it's not the quantity of people who had been fed, it's that Jesus can do what he needs to do to provide for people who have needs. But then immediately, as the story unfolds in Matthew 14, Jesus does this miracle, and there's a lot of conversation around that, a lot of rumors and whispers and people telling the story of what Jesus had done. But immediately after this happens, Jesus made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side. This is Matthew 14:22. While he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. And when evening came, he was there alone. So this is the mountain part of the story, right? We see the hard news and the miracle, and then at the middle of the story, there's this mountain. The mountain is not the main character of the story. The mountain is the setting in which the story takes place. The story is set on a mountain, but the mountain actually isn't the point of the story. The things that happened on the mountain could have happened in lots of places. But Jesus withdraws by himself to pray. And it's not just that Jesus went to a quiet place or went somewhere where there weren't distractions, where he could just sort of catch his breath and rest before he went on to do the next thing. What Jesus did there was intentionally connect with the Father. Right? So it happened to be on a mountain. And it happened to be in a place where there weren't other people around him, but the reality is it was a posture of saying, I want to live my life in rhythm and connection with God. So Jesus is showing us a helpful rhythm. He's withdrawing after these big moments, heavy moments, but big moments. He's connecting with the Father. He's preparing for the work ahead. And then from this moment in Matthew 14, the story actually shifts abruptly from Jesus on the mountain to the story of the disciples and the things that they're experiencing. The disciples who are being formed by a whole different set of circumstances and a whole different kind of experience on the water in the middle of the lake. I preached, actually, if you're interested in going deeper, we're going to move through all the parts of this bigger story fairly quickly. If you're interested in digging into this specific passage of this story, 2 years ago, actually exactly 2 years ago, we walked through this particular moment, this smaller part of the story, the disciples on the water, in the immediate aftermath of a tragedy that impacted our church community and some families who are part of this church that we love dearly. And so we had a different plan for that particular Sunday, but it was clear that God had asked us to set that conversation aside and have this conversation. And so if you're interested in going into depth in this part of the story, there's a message called Take Courage that's part of our Get Closer series. And it's an unpacking of this specific moment, the disciples on the water moment in the story. It says this in Matthew 14:24. It says this, let's see. But the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And in the fourth watch of the night, he, Jesus, came to them walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, "Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid." And then Peter answered him, "Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water." And he said, "Come." And so Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus. But when he saw the wind, he was afraid. And beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." And Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "You have little faith. Why did you doubt?" When they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshiped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." This is not a mountaintop kind of experience for the disciples, right? They're in a storm in the middle of the lake, but it changed them, right? God's presence and closeness to them in the midst of their storm changed not only their experience of the storm, but what changed how they saw Jesus, would shape then and change how they related to Jesus moving forward. They would have, I'm sure, at lots and lots of moments along the way as they followed through on the mission that Jesus placed in front of them, that they would have had moments where they would have various storms that would have been around them, whether that's persecution or hardship or being mistreated in various ways. And they would have, but remember, when the waves were against us and the wind was against us and we were terrified, Jesus came and did what only Jesus could do in that moment. They see Jesus so much more clearly because of his presence with them in the storm. And so they learned a lesson that would change both their relationship with Jesus. It would change radically the course of their lives. And when they had crossed over, verse 34, they came to land at Gennesaret. And when the men of that place recognized him, they sent around to all that region and brought to him all who were sick and implored him that they might only touch the fringe of his garment. And as many as touched it were made well. This is Jesus meeting people in the midst of the storms of their lives. This is Jesus meeting people in whatever storm they are in the middle of the lake of their lives that they're experiencing. Is what Jesus did with the disciples, he's now doing for people on the other side of the lake as he's stepping into their story and stepping into the hardships that they're experiencing, the things they can't fix for themselves, the waves they cannot calm. He brings hope and he brings healing. And so Jesus, many of us might feel like we're like on the outside of the Jesus story. And we might think, yep, sure, Jesus would show up for people who are really close to him, right? Like his disciples, the people he really cared about. He would walk out on water to help them. But man, what I'm facing and who I am, I don't know if God cares that much about me. But Jesus came to where they were. And it's not just that he healed people that seemed like they were close to him. They sent out from there and called in everyone who was sick. And then everyone, it says they brought to him all who were sick. It says not a select group of insiders, all who were sick. And as many as touched it were made well. The waves have been crashing all around them. Those of us who have experienced health crises and have been in need of healing, we know what it feels like the waves crashing all around. The wind is against them. And in a different kind of way, and in a different set of circumstances, it's like the words of Jesus on the water seem to echo on the shore. Take heart, it is I. Do not be afraid. When we look at this moment, right, a story with a mountain at the middle of the story, but not the point of the story, we look at this moment and what it means for us as we sort out all of this in this journey that we're walking together. There's two takeaways for us as we listen and watch and observe this story, as we experience the kinds of things that this story covers. First, we talked about the lesson that it seems like everybody else knows that we don't know. It's an opportunity for us to learn the lesson. And it's simply this, is God is with you. He cares, and he will help you. That God is with you. He cares, and he will help you. God is with you. He cares, and he will help you. God is not distant. God is not uncaring, and God is not powerless against the things that you're facing. He is with you. He cares, and he will help you. This lesson, by the way, is woven into every part of this story. From Jesus grieving as John the Baptist has experienced the death that he experienced, to the feeding of the 5,000, to the Jesus on a mountain, to the disciples in the lake, to the healing on the other side of the shore. All of these pieces, this lesson of God is with you. He cares, and he will help you. And so it's a lesson, actually, that we can learn in our grief. It's a lesson that we can learn when we have physical needs, like the people who had gathered to hear Jesus or to be with Jesus and were hungry, and Jesus met their needs. We can learn it in our grief. We can learn it in the meal. We can learn it on the mountain. We can learn it on the water in the middle of the storms of our lives. We can learn this lesson in that kind of setting. We can actually learn this lesson as God steps in and heals us in our sickness and in our times of physical need. Right? This lesson can be learned in all of those settings. Actually, if we take it all the way back to the beginning of this conversation, every one of those kinds of moments can be a thin place. Right? The grief and the needs and the mountain and the water and the storms and our need for healing. All of those can be thin places where we experience God, where he shows up and teaches us who he is and cares for us and attends to us and speaks into our lives. All of those can be thin places where God meets you and where God teaches you. But of all of the options, and this is the piece that talk about learning the lesson, of all of the places that we could learn this lesson, that God is with you, that he cares and he can help, the best place would be on the mountain. Right? Say, God, would you teach me consistently? Would you remind me day by day, as I live my life in conversation and relationship with you, would you teach me that you are with me? Would you show me that you care? Would you help me? Right? So we can learn this lesson in lots of settings, and more than even just what shows up in this story, but the best place is in a quiet conversation with God, a consistent and regular conversation with God where he continues to remind us of his presence, where he continues to speak into our lives. And then we take that lesson from that setting, and then we experience the other places, the places of grief and need and fear and healing. And we experience all of those things with the lesson of God is with you. He cares. He will help you. That we experience all of those other pieces with that lesson in view. We can learn at all those places, but how much better to allow God to teach us before we go in and walk into all of those things, the truth of himself and his relationship, the relationship he wants to have with us. So we learn the lesson. And we live in rhythm. Jesus reveals a rhythm in this story. First of all, that all places can be thin. Can be thin places. So it's about awareness and approach rather than location. But this rhythm, do the work, withdraw, connect, prepare for the work to come, repeat. Right? Over and over and over again, we see this process play out where there is work to be done, where there's things that have been placed in front of us. Do the work. It's not just that we have a relationship with God that doesn't require us to do anything. We don't do things to have a relationship with God, but we do the work. In a relationship, in a conversation with God, we then withdraw and we spend time with him. We connect with the Father, and then we prepare for the work to come. There's a whole lot of work that gets done in these stories. So Jesus, we see it play out. We see clearly what Jesus did, and we're going to get to that in just a moment, the things that he has done. But there are things that he asked of his followers, those people who were around him in this story. Jesus did beautiful and miraculous work, but people around him did work too. So like the followers and the crowd did things like they brought what they had to Jesus so that he could do a multiplying and providing work for the people who had come. They learned from Jesus in transformational conversations. They grew a deeper faith at each point along the way. And then on the shore, they brought others to Jesus who had need of healing, had need of connection and contact with Jesus. So there's the work that's being done as the story plays out. So it's like, do those kinds of things. And then withdraw. Make sure that you're finding time to not just work, but to connect with the Father who cares for you, right? The lesson that we're talking about, he's with you. He cares, and he can help. And connect. Jesus didn't just climb a mountain and then sit there by himself. He intentionally connected with the Father. For many of us, we have rhythms where we're like, I'm exhausted and I just need to stop. But then what we do is we go to, we pause, or we just kind of shut down, or we zone out, or we just let Netflix just roll show after show after show. And it's not restorative. It's not Sabbath. It's not us in relationship or connection with God. It's just us stopping doing things, but it's mindless and it's not helpful and it's not formative. Connect. Jesus didn't just get away from people. He got away so that he could connect with the Father. And then prepare. But there is work that still needs to be done. And so this process of, we don't have the recording of what Jesus had to say to the Father in this moment, but I can imagine that just from my own rhythms, as he's experienced grief and then a big, big, beautiful moment, that there's probably an element of giving to the Father the heavy stuff and receiving from the Father what he needed for what lies ahead. We talked a few moments ago about the work that Jesus' followers did in these stories. When we talk about preparing for the work ahead, let's actually pay specific attention to the work that Jesus did throughout this story. Jesus had transformational conversations where he helped people see him more clearly, helped them make sense of their lives and make sense of the storm and what God was doing in their lives. He did this. He met needs. He was a calming and stabilizing presence in the storm. He navigated tricky situations with frustrating people, right? Peter doubting and then sinking into the water, and the disciples in their fear that they had after even having experienced Jesus' miracle and knowing what Jesus was capable of, they were still afraid. Their faith still was shaken when they experienced an unexpected hardship. Even after they had witnessed Jesus do miraculous things and been part of the conversations that they had been part of, they still were shaken. So Jesus navigated tricky situations with frustrating people. And Jesus did healing work. I don't know which of those kinds of work that Jesus did that you might need this morning. What I do know, it's the kind of work that he does. And so we need that kind of work that Jesus does to prepare us for the work that's in front of us. Say, God, I need healing. God, I need you to help me navigate difficult relationships. God, I am in a storm and I need your calming presence, your stabilizing presence as the wind and the waves are just rocking my world in every kind of way. God, I need a transformational conversation that helps me see my life and see who you are and what you're doing in my life differently. God, I have needs that need to be met. God, I cannot provide for myself, or I can't provide for my family in the way that I long to provide for them. God, would you show up and meet our needs in that kind of way? I don't know. I don't know what kind of work that you need Jesus to do. I just know that this is the kind of work he does, to prepare you for whatever is in front of you. And then there's the repeat. Then we go and we do the work. To learn the lesson in a place where we can carry it with us into wherever we might go from where we learned the lesson, to live our life in that kind of rhythm. It's a beautiful thing. It's an invitation to a lifetime of living in relationship and connection with God, not just God up there, and when we need him, we'll go find him, but life in rhythm and in step with God, letting God do what only God can do in and through our lives.